Well, all of this is really up on that Teflon washer, so it doesn't really require anything in the way of lubrication, but I'm giving that just the faintest wipe of molybdenum paste there, and you can see I'm dusting it off with my finger. I really don't want anything sticking on there, because that Teflon washer thing is just so fragile, really. I don't want to compromise it. And these things, they have a material on there which I presume is something of a similar nature, some very low friction material, and that has worn over time. So putting a wipe of molybdenum paste on there certainly won't hurt. And I'll put these in place and see if I can get this thing to move smoothly. That's my main concern, is that the focus moves smoothly, focus adjustment, without any undue rattle. It should be good at containing the lens longitudinally in the mount, so that there's no focus change, there's no shift that way, but should rotate smoothly. That doesn't even sit flat. This lens has been seriously damaged. That brass clamp is twisted. I'm not even sure how I'd go about doing that if I wanted to do it. This is all twisted up. I've got no idea how that happened. What's the other one like? Is that as bad? Try the other one. That's just weird. I only picked up on that because as I started to tighten the screws up, it obviously wasn't fitting flat. This one's okay. So it's just one of the brass pieces that's been bent out of shape. And as I say, I'm not sure how I'd go about doing that if I wanted to. That's really twisted. It doesn't look even vaguely straight. You can hear me in the background sorting through my piles of odd parts. And I don't have one of those. I do have an entire mount. I'm reluctant to break that up unless I need to. Okay, I'm going to have to work on this, see if I can straighten it out. This end's only slightly bent, this end is really twisted. I've never seen anything like that. Okay, with a bit of judicious hammering and tapping on that bench block and bending with pliers and so forth, I got that piece straightened out. And this is actually moving quite smoothly and quite well. I haven't adjusted it yet to make sure that there's no excess play. Excess play is taken out by slackening these screws and pushing the brass pieces to the outside, which of course, because it's a wedge shape, pulls the lens in closer to the mount and takes up any play. So you have movement in this axis this way with these two screws, and movement in this axis over these two screws. So I just have to play with this until I'm happy that it moves freely but there's no excess play. And there's certainly rattle in that direction. Well, that screw wasn't done up tight, so that'll explain that. Make sure its mate is done up tight. Now that's too tight. No, that's certainly too tight, that's binding. That's okay. So the position of those two screws appears to be okay. It's snug, it's not rattling. Let's try the other two screws. There's certainly some play there. First I'll check that I've actually got the screws down tight. I have. Now, there's no play there. I'd like to say it's smooth all across its range, but there's sort of like a tight spot. I wonder whether the aluminium rim on this focus scale was also bent when that brass piece was bent. There's no obvious sign of that. Watching the movement here of the relative of the two surfaces, I'm not seeing any up and down movement, but of course it might only be very slight. There's something rattling backwards and forwards with it here. It might be a piece of that tape that I put on there. I might have to remove that entirely and do that again. Well, that seems to have been successful. So I'm going to put the guidepost back on here. And that will clamp down that Teflon washer too, although that's not the damaged area. Unfortunately, I've got sticky stuff all over my tweezers, so I'm going to have to do a careful cleaning with some solvent to get rid of that rubbish. That piece of black tape that I had holding this together was too close to the aluminium ring before, and it was rubbing on it. Basically, that would have ended up pulling some of the tape or the adhesive into the joint there and make this rough. This is moving nicely now. I'm very pleased with that. My main concern now is to make sure there's no undue rattle, but it doesn't appear to be. It appears to be good. So, that's that part. Of course, I had the back the stripped lens mount on the back of that while I was working on that, just so that I had something to hold it by. Okay, so this lens has been interesting in more than one way. That pin appears to be firmly fixed now. It took a drop of super glue in there to ensure that that stayed there. The lens mount is very discoloured. It looks a little bit like corrosion, but I'm not sure that it is. Now I am sure that it is. It's quite powdery, that deposit. I suspect it's been splashed at some stage. Yeah, there's a bit of roughness to that metal. I'll clean this with a bit of metal polish, I think, see if I can improve the look of that. Well, it's not perfect, but it's a big improvement, and all I did was give that a quick go over with a bit of Brasso to polish that nickel plating. The nickel plating is reasonably thick, it's not like I polished right through it or anything, but it's just taken that tarnish look off the back of that. And this now, I'll have to clean up the rangefinder coupling here for the Retina 3S camera. Clean this, get rid of all the sticky, dirty, dried grease out of it, and reassemble that part, and that'll be the lens mount ready to go back onto it once I get to that stage. Well, I'll start the reassembly. Start by putting my springs back in place. You've got two springs. One was a very fine spring, one was a coarser spring. Now the fine spring is very good at staying on the post. So I've put the coarse spring on first, then fit the fine spring. It should stay where it's put. At least that's the theory. So, piece number one, right. Just going to run a bit of molybdenum paste on that track. This little cam arrangement follows that. Check that that's seated correctly. It's sitting up. Why is it sitting up? That seems better. I'll just give that a wipe around the inside edge. That seems to move nicely. Right, our first depth of field pointer goes in there, and that little pin that sticks up has to come up through this gap here. Like that. And this one, from memory, had the coarse spring. We've got our separator that keeps the two pieces apart. This has got a little notch in it, a little pin that drops into that notch. Is that symmetrical? Appears to be. I'll hook that spring into position. We've got our second depth of field pointer. Of course, this has to be timed correctly. In other words, it needs to be at the end of its track here, when that one's at the end of its track there, and engaged with the gear at that point. That looks right. So to get the spring on this one's a bit trickier. It's easier to do it when it's not on the track. The spring's very good at getting trapped underneath. I'll just check that my spring is looking correctly laid out. There doesn't appear to be any problem with that. My pointers appear to be symmetrical. This piece goes on. What direction? I've got that upside down, probably. Yes, I have. It goes on there like that. It's moving nicely. And then this piece. Well, we've got this only goes on one way. It's got a pin that locates it. Visible here. But also we have to get our focus adjustment here. That's on the focus scale. We need to have that line up with the notch here. So in practice that will be at what point? At that point there, opposite that hole. And in theory that should all go. Our depth of field pointers move smoothly, but are they symmetrical? Yes, you can see there that they are. So that's all good. And I can put the 4 screws in the back. Yes, everything's coupled up. The rangefinder coupling's there. Everything appears to be good. So this deals with the problem that I came in knowing about, which was the depth of field pointers did not return smoothly to the rest position. The depth of field pointers are also coupled to the aperture settings on the camera. So that means that when you are turning the wheel on the bottom of the camera to change the aperture and effectively the meter setting, that would have been stiff too. Well, where we were before we were so rudely interrupted by the camera deciding there was insufficient card space was that the mount is all done and dusted. And this lens capsule needs to be dealt with. The grease is exceptionally sticky. The rear group comes off easily. So I can hold that to the light. There's a little bit of dust on the inside surface, but generally that's all good. This piece, I'd rather remove this from the mount if I possibly can. I'll get that grease off there first because I'm going to have my hands all over that trying to hold things while I'm unscrewing it. get this grease off here. I'm using Naphtha, and I will have to do this multiple times to get this really filthy, dusty, dirty grease out of here. These very fine threads are heavily clogged up with rubbish. Particularly when the grease is very hard and dry, you may well find that you can't get all of the grease out of the thread like this. What you can do is you can put the mating piece back on, pour a bit of solvent between the two and work it backwards and forwards, and that'll often clear stuff out of the threads that you can't otherwise encourage out. Some of this thread feels a little bit rough to me. It could have been like that right from the time it was machined. I don't know what that mystery noise is out there. It's probably somebody with a garden tool of some sort. Nice sunny day here for a change. Far too nice to be working. Alright, well that's good for a start. It means I can get my hands around that without getting covered in filth. I've got to encourage this lens unit out of the brass mount. So, what's worth a go? Well, we need something to give us some friction. I'll stick that on my bench block, push down hard and twist. And there we go. Something had to go first, and fortunately it wasn't my hand. Okay, so that clears that out the way. That lens I really need to have a close look at, and I'll carry on cleaning this up and get its mating part cleaned up, and then go back and look at the glass. The rear group I will not put back in place until I've got this all together, and I'll show you why when we get to that stage. But the front group I'd normally fit in place. Well, that's quite good. Still with its mating piece here. Which is not quite good, as you can see. That's a weird sound out there. I might be forced to go and investigate and find out what odd machine makes that noise. Just about clean, I think. Okay, let's put that back on there. It's not as smooth as I'd like. Let's put a bit of solvent on there for good measure. That was just some naphtha, and I'll just work that backwards and forwards. As I say, that can be a good way to loosen up dried grease that doesn't otherwise want to move. that moves nice and freely now. It's got a dry feel to it too, which means of course that there's no grease at all left on there to speak of, but it's all pretty much just bare brass on brass. There's not much coming off, but I want all of that dust and dirt and dried grease off there. That's pretty good. Not as smooth as I'd like it to be, but it's pretty good. Yeah, there's just still a bit of filth embedded in those threads. I can just tell by the way that works. I'll carry on cleaning this.